The sound of waves brushed softly against the California shore that morning, a rhythm too gentle for the storm inside Ethan Cole. From the outside, he looked exactly as people imagined a CEO should: sharp suit, steady gaze, a man who had everything under control. But control was an illusion, and it was slipping. He had once laughed at her at Claire Bennett, his quiet, efficient assistant who blended into the gray corridors of his empire like she was part of the wallpaper. 2 years by his side, invisible, predictable, safe, until now. Now she stood by the pool, sunlight gliding over her shoulders, her laughter mingling with the sound of water and distant music. And Ethan, the man who never allowed emotion to interfere with business, felt a burn he couldn't name. Jealousy, regret, maybe both. It's strange, isn't it? How we only start to see someone when the rest of the world does. How pride can blind us to beauty that was there all along. But every story of arrogance has its breaking point, and every quiet heart, when finally seen, learns the power of being enough. This is the moment when the man who thought he owned everything begins to lose control, not of his company, but of his heart. Stay with me, because this story doesn't begin with love. It begins with awakening. The morning light in Seattle never really shines. It drifts, soft, gray, a little tired, like the city itself. Through the glass walls of the 32nd floor, the skyline stretched out beneath a blanket of mist, and somewhere in that quiet fog, a man stood perfectly still. Ethan Cole's reflection stared back at him from the window. Sharp suit, silver tie, no smile. He'd been in the office since before sunrise, as always. The city was still half asleep, but his day had already started 3 hours ago. Emails, meetings, numbers, everything in perfect order. That was how he liked it. Behind him, the soft click of heels echoed down the corridor, his assistant bringing the morning reports. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He knew the rhythm of every sound in this building, the hum of the elevator, the whir of the espresso machine, the quiet shuffle of staff who spoke in whispers whenever he passed. To most people, Ethan Cole was a man carved from precision, a mind built on logic, a will that never bent. They said he could negotiate a billion-dollar deal without raising his voice, that he never laughed, never lingered, never lost. They were right, mostly. What they didn't see, what Ethan himself refused to see, was the silence that filled the spaces between his victories. Silence had become his closest companion. He turned from the window, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, everything immaculate down to the inch. On his desk, a row of pens lined up in perfect symmetry, beside a stack of contracts he'd already memorized. Control, it was his armor. When the door opened, he didn't look up. "Leave the quarterly summaries there," he said, voice calm, distant. "Yes, sir," came the quiet reply. Her voice steady, respectful, drifted into the room like a faint trace of warmth. Claire Bennett, his executive assistant, efficient, invisible. Ethan knew she'd been with him for almost 2 years, though if someone asked him her favorite color or the sound of her laughter, he wouldn't have an answer. She was part of the system, the gears that kept his empire running. She placed the folder on his desk. For a moment, the faint scent of lavender brushed the air between them. He ignored it, kept his eyes on the report. "Meeting with the legal team at 10, she reminded softly. "The investors' dinner has been moved to Thursday." He nodded without looking up. "Confirm it." Claire hesitated for a fraction of a second, long enough for Ethan to glance up. Just once. Their eyes met. Hers held the calm of someone used to being unseen. He looked away first. When she left, the silence returned, louder than before. Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of control pressing like an iron band around his chest. He reached for his coffee, lukewarm now, and stared at the skyline again. Power was supposed to feel exhilarating, but lately, it just felt heavy. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Cole, the board is waiting." He straightened his tie, his mask sliding neatly back into place. On my way. In the conference room, rows of executives waited, eyes sharp, eager to impress. Ethan spoke with the ease of a man who had nothing left to prove, every word precise, measured, final, but halfway through a presentation, his mind wandered not far, just enough to notice a small thing, the faint ring mark on the table where someone had placed a coffee cup without a coaster. He frowned. Imperfection irritated him. It reminded him of something he couldn't quite name, something human. When the meeting ended, he walked past the glass corridor lined with awards and photographs, his life displayed like an exhibit. There he was at 25, shaking hands with investors. At 30, on the cover of Forbes. At 37, he had it all. Or so they said. Yet lately, when he caught his reflection, he barely recognized the man staring back. Too polished, too certain, too alone. He returned to his office just as the sky began to clear. Sunlight broke through the clouds in thin streaks, landing on the corner of his desk, where a single framed photo stood his parents on their porch in Portland, smiling, arms wrapped around each other. He hadn't visited in months, maybe a year. The phone rang. Ethan answered with his usual crisp tone. Yes, Mr. Cole, Claire's voice again. The contractor from California is online too. They're asking about your schedule for next week. Tell them I'll be there in person, he said, almost without thinking. A pause. In person, sir, yes. Make the arrangements. He hung up, staring at the receiver for a moment. He didn't know why he'd said that. He rarely traveled unless absolutely necessary. But something in him, something restless, had already decided. Outside, the city glimmered under the thin sun, and for the first time in months, Ethan felt the faintest shift. Not change, exactly. Just the whisper of it. He glanced at the closed door, where moments ago Claire had stood. A quiet thought surfaced before he could push it away. How she never complained, never faltered. How she always seemed to know what he needed before he said it. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. Feelings complicated things. Instead, he focused on his reflection in the window once more. The skyline stretched endlessly before him, steady, predictable, under control, but deep down, even Ethan Cole could sense it. The wind was changing direction, and soon, control wouldn't be enough. He didn't know it yet, but the next time that soft voice would call his name, he'd finally look up. The rain had stopped by the time Claire arrived at the office. Seattle mornings always smelled faintly of wet concrete and coffee, a mix she had learned to love. She paused at the revolving glass doors, adjusted her tote bag on her shoulder, and took a quiet breath before stepping inside. Another day, another set of tasks, another 12 hours of keeping everything in order for a man who seemed allergic to chaos and to warmth. The lobby glowed with a pale light that made every surface gleam. People moved briskly, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Claire greeted the receptionist with a polite smile, pressed the elevator button, and stood still as the mirrored doors closed around her reflection. Neat bun, plain navy dress, glasses slightly crooked from rushing through the drizzle. She fixed them automatically. Perfection mattered here, even for someone no one really looked at. When she reached the 32nd floor, the silence felt heavier, like the air itself followed Ethan Cole's rules. Phones didn't ring here, they hummed discreetly. Conversations never carried past a whisper. Claire moved through the corridor with practiced precision, her heels landing softly on the polished floor. On her desk, outside the CEO's office, a stack of files waited, aligned perfectly as always. She glanced at the clock, 7:29 a.m. Ethan would arrive in 1 minute. He always did. The elevator chimed exactly on cue. Claire straightened the papers, smoothed her skirt, and lifted her chin just as the tall figure appeared at the end of the hallway. His pace was measured, his expression unreadable, a black overcoat draped over his arm, silver cufflinks glinting under the recessed lights. "Good morning, Mr. Cole," she said. He gave a brief nod, already scanning his phone. "Morning. What's first your call with the European partners at 8, followed by the legal review? Send me the updated projections before that. They're in your inbox. He paused just long enough to glance up. All ready? Yes. Ethan studied her for a fraction of a second, as if evaluating an algorithm that worked too well. Then he gave a single approving nod and disappeared into his office. The door closed, soft as a sigh. Claire let out the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Every day with Ethan Cole was like walking across a frozen lake, smooth, beautiful, and always one wrong step away from cracking. Still, she respected him, maybe even admired him, though she would never admit it out loud. His focus was relentless, his standards impossible, and somehow she kept up. That was her quiet victory. The morning unfolded in a rhythm she knew by heart. Emails, phone calls, schedules shifting like puzzle pieces. Ethan's voice carried through the intercom, now and then low, precise, never emotional. Claire moved around the office like a shadow, silent, steady, invisible. She made sure his coffee stayed hot. His reports arrived before he asked. His meetings ran on time down to the minute. Around noon, she noticed something small. Ethan's pen, the silver one engraved with his initials, was missing from its usual place. She searched the drawers, the folders, even under a stack of files. Then, without thinking, she walked quietly into his office. He was standing by the window again, staring at the rain. "Mr. Cole," she said softly. He turned, one brow raised. "Yes, I think you left your pen in the conference room earlier." She extended it toward him. His hand brushed hers when he reached for it, a quick, accidental touch, but something about it made her pulse skip. His skin was warm, unexpectedly human. Ethan didn't notice. He was already looking back at his screen. "Thank you," he said simply. She nodded, backing away, but as she turned to leave, she caught her reflection in the window beside him, two figures, one sharp and commanding, the other small and almost transparent. For a second, it struck her how invisible she'd become in his world. The afternoon passed quietly. Around 3, she found herself retyping an entire report because a single comma was out of place. Ethan's standards had trained her to see flaws before anyone else did. The office was nearly empty when she finally shut down her computer. "Good night, Mr. Cole," she called softly from the doorway. He didn't look up. "Good night, Claire." It was the first time he'd said her name in weeks. She froze for a heartbeat. Something about hearing it spoken in that even, distant tone made her chest tighten. "See you tomorrow," she murmured, and left before the silence could swallow her again. Outside, the rain had returned, falling in gentle sheets across the city lights. Claire walked slowly toward the bus stop, her umbrella trembling slightly in the wind. Around her, people hurried past, phones pressed to their ears, eyes fixed on destinations. She wondered what it felt like to live a life not dictated by someone else's calendar. The bus came, brakes hissing against wet pavement. She climbed aboard, found a seat by the window, and rested her forehead against the cool glass. Her reflection looked tired but calm, reliable, ordinary. She thought of the office of Ethan, of how every detail in his world ran perfectly because she made it so, but perfection was a lonely thing to maintain. As the city blurred outside, Claire remembered something her mother used to say when life felt too small one day. "You'll wake up and realize you've been waiting for permission to live." She smiled faintly, watching the streetlights flicker through the rain. Tomorrow, she'd be back at the office before sunrise. She'd file the contracts, schedule the meetings, make the coffee exactly how he liked it, and Ethan Cole would nod, just once, without looking up. But somewhere, deep inside, a small, quiet part of her had begun to stir a whisper that said life couldn't stay this way forever. In the steady hum of the bus engine, that whisper grew just loud enough to hear. Something was changing. She couldn't name it yet, but she could feel it like the soft tremor of light beneath a sky still heavy with clouds. And soon, someone would notice. The rain had eased by morning, leaving the city washed and quiet. From her desk outside the glass office, Claire could hear the steady tick of the wall clock, the low hum of the espresso machine down the hall, and the faint rustle of paper as Ethan turned a page inside. It was a morning, like hundreds before it, predictable, precise, and polished. Until it wasn't. At 8:07, the door to his office opened. Ethan stepped out, phone in hand, his expression unreadable but sharper than usual. "Claire," he said, his tone clipped, focused. "We're going to California next week." She looked up, pen paused above her notepad. California. For the opening of the new research center, Malibu. "It's been moved ahead of schedule. I'll need you there to coordinate." She blinked once, letting the words sink in. Of course. Should I book the flights, the hotel, and prepare the itinerary? He was already turning back toward his office. "And clear my calendar for those days. You'll be traveling with me." The door closed before she could answer. For a moment, Claire just sat there, the quiet pressing in around her. She had never traveled with him before. Business trips were for senior managers, not assistants. But then again, Ethan Cole rarely explained his decisions. In his world, everything simply was. She exhaled slowly, staring at her reflection in the black surface of her monitor. Her own face looked uncertain, as if asking, "When was the last time anyone asked if you were ready for anything?" She picked up the phone, her voice steady as she began making arrangements. "Yes, this is Claire Bennett from Cole Dynamics. I'd like to confirm a reservation for 2. Through the glass wall, she could see Ethan pacing, his phone pressed to his ear, his gestures controlled but tight. There was something restless in the way he moved that morning. Perhaps it was just another high-stakes launch, another deal worth millions. But to Claire, it felt like the air itself had changed. By afternoon, the plans were in place. 2 first-class tickets to Los Angeles, a black SUV waiting at LAX, 3 nights at the Malibu Horizon Resort, overlooking the Pacific. She'd read the brochure while booking white balconies, ocean breeze, golden sunsets. It sounded like another world entirely, far from the rain and glass walls of Seattle. At 5 o'clock, when she brought the updated itinerary to his desk, Ethan was typing an email, his jaw tight. "Leave it there," he said without looking up. She placed the folder neatly by his laptop, then hesitated. "Would you like me to confirm the dinner with the investors for the evening we arrive?" "Yes, make it private dining, somewhere quiet." She noted it down, then turned to leave. But before she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Claire." She turned. "Yes, sir." He looked up then, his gaze direct but not unkind. "Pack light, we won't have much downtime." She nodded, a small, polite smile. Understood. When she left the office that evening, the city lights shimmered through a thin veil of rain. She walked slower than usual, the word California echoing in her mind. It sounded like sunlight and possibility, and something she couldn't quite name. That night, in her small apartment on Capitol Hill, Claire opened her closet. The clothes hung like rows of quiet shadows, gray, navy, black, the colors of safety. She ran her fingers along the fabric, pausing at a plain dress she'd worn countless times to the office. Reliable, invisible. She sighed and shut the door. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, a new message from the travel agency confirming the flight details. She read the words twice, then set the phone down. Outside her window, the rain had turned to mist. The city looked softer under the streetlights, like a photograph out of focus. Claire watched the droplets race down the glass, her mind still circling the same thought. He didn't ask if I could go. He just decided I would. And yet, she didn't feel angry. Maybe that was what unsettled her most. She had accepted that this was her role to be ready before she was asked, to exist quietly in the orbit of someone else's certainty. Still, as she lay in bed, sleep slow to come, she wondered if California would be different. If the sun might feel like a kind of freedom. The next morning, she arrived at the office earlier than usual. The sky outside was pale, streaked with gold. Ethan's car was already parked below. When she stepped inside the lobby, the receptionist greeted her with a surprised smile. "You're early today." Claire smiled faintly, just getting ready for the trip. On the 32nd floor, the lights were still dim. She turned them on one by one, the office coming alive around her, coffee brewing, computer screens waking, the faint hum of the building returning. When Ethan arrived, he paused briefly at her desk. "Morning," he said. "Morning. Mr. Cole, I finalized the travel documents. Your flight departs Monday at 9. He glanced at the folder she handed him, then gave a single nod. "Good." There was something in his eyes she hadn't noticed before, something almost like curiosity. It passed quickly, hidden behind his usual calm. The rest of the day went on as always, but between scheduling calls and printing contracts, Claire caught herself thinking about sunlight on water, about how different air might feel when it wasn't heavy with rain. She pushed the thought away, focusing on the numbers glowing on her screen. Yet, under the hum of the office, her heart carried a quiet rhythm of its own. When she finally left that evening, she paused at the door of Ethan's office. The blinds were half closed, light spilling across the floor in sharp lines. He was still at his desk, his tie loosened, eyes fixed on the window. Something about that image, the man who controlled everything, sitting alone in the fading light, made her chest tighten. She almost spoke, almost asked if he ever felt tired of it all. But she didn't. She simply said, "Good night, Mr. Cole." He looked up, and for once, his reply came softer than usual. "Good night, Claire." Outside, the wind carried the smell of rain mixed with something new, the faint, uncertain scent of change. And though neither of them knew it yet, California would soon take everything familiar between them and turn it quietly, irrevocably, into something else. The office emptied slowly that evening, one light at a time. By 7, the floor was quiet, only the hum of the air conditioner and the faint tick of a wall clock filling the space. Claire shut her laptop, stacked the last of the folders neatly, and slipped her planner into her bag. She turned off the lamp, then paused by the glass wall that framed the city below. Seattle looked silver and cold under the rain. The streets shimmered like a web of light. Cars moved like tiny, glowing veins through the fog. She stood there for a while, letting her reflection merge with the city's just another blurred shape in the glass. Behind her, Ethan's office was dark. He had left earlier than usual after another tense phone call. His last words had been brisk as always. "You'll have the new schedule tomorrow morning." Then he was gone, leaving the faint scent of cologne and that lingering silence he carried everywhere. Claire looked at the spot where he had stood hours ago, his chair perfectly aligned, his pens in order, his world untouched by warmth. It used to fascinate her, the discipline, the composure, the power of a man who never seemed uncertain. But tonight, she didn't feel admiration. She felt distance. She moved closer to the glass, her hand resting lightly on the cold surface. Her own reflection looked back, neat bun, plain dress, tired eyes behind thick frames. The image was so familiar, it felt like a uniform she couldn't take off. For years, she had defined herself by how useful she could be, how invisible she could become while keeping everything else flawless. She had learned to move quietly, to speak only when needed, to anticipate before anyone asked. In return, she had earned trust, respect, even a kind of safety. But safety, she realized, wasn't the same as living. A drop of rain slid down the glass, cutting her reflection in two. The woman she saw looked older than she remembered 30, but with the weariness of someone who'd forgotten what she wanted long ago. Her chest tightened. When did I stop seeing myself? She remembered her first day at Coal Dynamics, nervous and hopeful, believing that competence would be enough to build a life she could be proud of. Somewhere along the way, that young woman had disappeared into routine buried under deadlines, under someone else's goals. She let out a soft laugh, the sound small in the empty room. "You're a ghost in your own story," she whispered. The elevator chimed faintly in the distance, someone leaving, or maybe a janitor arriving for the night shift. The world kept moving, whether she stood still or not. She gathered her things and stepped out into the hallway. The carpet muffled her steps. As she passed the rows of glass offices, she saw her reflection repeating in each one 100 versions of the same woman walking through silence. When she reached the lobby, the marble floor caught her reflection again, warped and shimmering under the lights. She stopped once more, caught between the clean brightness of the lobby and the soft darkness outside the doors. Through the glass, she could see the city, its glow stretching endlessly. Somewhere out there, people were laughing over dinner, chasing dreams, falling in love, making mistakes, living, and she was here, efficient, invisible, replaceable. The thought stung, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. She stepped closer to the glass until her breath fogged a small circle on its surface. Inside that blur, her face looked softer, younger somehow. It felt like a fragile glimpse of the person she used to be, the one who painted on weekends, who loved old bookstores and late-night walks, who dreamed of travel and open skies. Where had she gone? The answer came quietly. You let yourself disappear in the name of being dependable. Her phone buzzed in her bag, breaking the stillness. A reminder for tomorrow's early meeting. She silenced it without looking. For a long moment, she simply stood there, watching her reflection fade into the night beyond the glass. The city lights seemed to flicker in rhythm with her heartbeat. Something inside her shifted, not loud, not sudden, just a small, undeniable movement, the kind that begins before you even know you've changed. She turned away, walking toward the exit. The automatic doors opened with a sigh, releasing her into the cool night air. The rain had stopped, but the streets still glistened. She walked without hurrying, her heels clicking softly against the wet pavement. The air smelled faintly of coffee and asphalt, a strangely comforting mix. Halfway down the block, she passed the reflection of herself in a storefront window. She almost didn't recognize the woman looking back, not because of how she looked, but because of how she felt aware, awake. For the first time in a long time, she saw not a shadow, but the outline of someone waiting to step back into her own life. She stopped at the crosswalk, watching the red light flicker. Her reflection trembled in the puddles at her feet, bending with every ripple. She smiled, just a little, and whispered, "Maybe it's time." The light turned green. Claire crossed the street. The night was still cold, the city still gray. But somewhere, under that thick blanket of rain clouds, dawn was already preparing to rise. And though she didn't know it yet, this quiet awakening, this small decision to see herself again, would change everything. Everything. Saturday arrived with a soft drizzle, the kind Seattle seemed to keep tucked in its pockets year-round. The streets glistened, reflecting the muted light of early morning. Claire walked without an umbrella, her hands tucked deep in her coat pockets, her steps slow but certain. She didn't have anywhere urgent to be. No meetings, no schedules, no Mr. Cole waiting behind glass walls. Just silence, and her own company. The night before, she'd stood by her bathroom mirror for a long time, staring at the woman looking back. The same face she saw every morning, neat, careful, tired. She had whispered, almost shyly, "Something has to change. Now." That whisper had turned into motion. At the corner of Pine and Broadway, a small salon sat between a flower shop and a vintage bookstore. Its window glowed warm, golden, inviting. Inside, women were laughing, a radio played softly, and the air smelled faintly of coffee and hairspray. Claire paused outside for a moment, her heart quickening. She hadn't done anything spontaneous in years, not since she couldn't even remember when. The bell chimed softly as she stepped inside. A woman with silver-streaked curls looked up from behind the counter and smiled. "Good morning, sweetheart." "First time here?" Claire nodded. "Yes. I'd like to change my hair." The stylist tilted her head, studying Claire kindly. "Good. That's how all great stories start." An hour later, Strands of chestnut fell gently to the floor. The mirror showed a different version of her, softer, freer somehow. Her hair brushed just below her chin now, its new color warm and alive under the light. The stylist dabbed a little foundation on her cheek, a touch of mascara, a hint of gloss. When it was done, she stepped back. "There you are," the woman said. Claire blinked. "What do you mean?" The stylist smiled. "You, the one who's been hiding." For a moment, Claire couldn't speak. It wasn't vanity that caught her. It was recognition. For the first time in so long, she saw herself and didn't look away. When she left the salon, the rain had stopped, the air smelled clean, and a faint breeze tugged at the edges of her coat. She walked aimlessly through Capitol Hill, her reflection glancing back at her from the cafe windows and passing cars. She didn't look different enough for strangers to notice, but she felt it in the way her shoulders relaxed, the way she met her own eyes without flinching. At a small boutique tucked beside a record store, a mannequin wore a simple cream dress, elegant, structured, not too loud. She hesitated outside, then went in. The clerk, a young man with kind eyes, smiled. "Looking for something special, I think so," she said quietly. 2 hours later, Claire left with 3 dresses neatly folded into a paper bag, soft fabrics, muted tones, the kind of clothes that didn't hide a person, but didn't shout either, just spoke softly, with confidence. She carried them home like fragile proof that change was real. At home. She made tea and opened her laptop. The glow of the screen filled her small apartment. For the first time, she typed her name into a search bar, not for work, not for research, just curiosity. Nothing came up except her company bio. She stared at the small line of text, executive assistant. Coal dynamics, reliable, precise, efficient, a job description, not a person. She closed the laptop. The quiet pressed against her, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt open, like space waiting to be filled. On Sunday morning, sunlight spilled through her window, a rare gift in Seattle. She stood before her mirror again, this time without hesitation. Her new hair caught the light, her skin looked brighter, her eyes clearer. She dabbed a bit of blush, the way the stylist had shown her, and slipped into one of her new dresses. It wasn't fancy, it was just hers. She brewed coffee, humming softly, and opened her journal, something she hadn't touched in years. The pages were mostly blank. She began to write. Not about work. Not about Ethan. Just small things, what she noticed, what she missed, what she wanted, words that belonged to no one but her. By afternoon, she took a walk by Lake Union. The air was crisp, the water calm, dotted with boats rocking gently. Families passed by, couples laughed, joggers waved. She sat on a bench, watching the ripples shimmer in the sunlight. It had been a long time since she'd simply existed without purpose. She thought of the woman in the glass office, the one who had whispered she was a ghost in her own story. That woman was still her, but maybe, finally, she was learning how to come back. As the sun began to set, Claire tucked her hands into her pockets and smiled softly. Her hair lifted in the breeze, catching hints of gold. She felt lighter. Not because everything had changed, but because she had begun. When she returned home, she laid out her clothes for Monday morning, her first day back after the quiet rebellion of the weekend. A navy pencil skirt, a white blouse, and one of her new blazers. Clean lines, subtle grace. She stood back and looked at it, then at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back wasn't someone new. She was someone rediscovered. Before turning off the lights, Claire whispered a promise to her reflection. No more fading. The room fell into stillness. Outside, the city hummed softly, unaware of the small revolution unfolding in one quiet apartment on Capitol Hill. But for Claire Bennett, it was enough. Enough to feel alive again. And somewhere, deep in the rhythm of the city's rain, life waited ready to notice her. This time, Monday morning began with sunlight, Not the shy, gray light that usually settled over Seattle, but real sunlight, thin and golden, slipping through the cracks of the clouds. Claire stood at the corner of Fifth Avenue, coffee in hand, the city slowly stirring awake around her. Her reflection in the glass doors of Coal Dynamics was almost unfamiliar. Shorter hair framed her face softly, her glasses now lighter, the dark frames replaced by something delicate. Her blouse was ivory, tucked neatly into a fitted skirt, and a subtle shade of rose brushed her lips. It wasn't glamour, it was presence. She looked like herself, only now. She appeared inside the lobby. The marble floor gleamed under the morning light. People moved briskly, carrying files, greeting one another in hushed voices. Claire walked through the space with quiet confidence. Her steps had a new rhythm, steady, unhurried, grounded. She felt the air around her notice, even if no one said a word. The receptionist looked up, smiled in surprise, and almost didn't recognize her. "Good morning, Ms. Bennett," she said, voice soft but a little brighter than usual. Claire returned the smile. "Morning?" The elevator doors slid open, reflecting her image once more. She stepped inside, alone. As the floor numbers climbed, she caught herself breathing differently, not shallow, not rushed, just steady. The kind of breath you take when you finally stop apologizing for existing. The 32nd floor was quiet as always. The familiar scent of coffee and paper filled the air. Claire reached her desk, setting down her bag, arranging her notes. A calm stillness spread through her chest. She didn't feel nervous, just ready. When Ethan arrived, the elevator chimed like a cue in a silent play. He walked out with his usual purpose dark suit, phone in hand, mind already 10 steps ahead of the room. Claire glanced up. "Good morning, Mr. Cole." She greeted softly. He didn't look up from his screen. "Morning. Is the car ready?" "Yes. 10 minutes early?" "Good." He walked past her desk toward his office, not noticing, or maybe not looking closely enough to notice. Claire's lips curved slightly. She didn't mind. Not this time. She followed her routine, double-checked the itinerary, confirmed the flight, printed the final schedule. Every movement felt different, though the tasks were the same. Her hands weren't trembling, her shoulders didn't tighten. She moved with quiet assurance, the way someone does when they finally believe they belong in the space they've occupied all along. At 8:30, Ethan stepped out of his office, coat over his arm. "Let's go," he said simply. Claire nodded, collecting her tablet and phone. They walked side by side toward the elevator. His attention stayed fixed on his phone, his thumb moving in quick motions over the screen. He was already halfway through the day in his mind. Emails, meetings, numbers, control. Outside, a black car waited at the curb. The driver opened the door, the city breeze carrying the faint scent of coffee and asphalt. Claire slid into the seat opposite Ethan. The car pulled away from the building, the skyline rising behind them like glass mountains. For the first few miles, neither spoke. Ethan reviewed notes on his tablet. Claire looked out the window, watching the streets fade into motion. The city passed in patterns of gray and gold, familiar yet somehow new. When the car stopped at a red light near the waterfront, she glanced at the reflection in the window, the two of them sitting opposite each other. Him, precise and unreadable. Her, steady and composed. A small thought drifted through her mind. He hasn't noticed yet? She smiled faintly at her own reflection, a secret between her and the glass. At the airport, they moved through security quickly, the rhythm of travel efficient and silent. Claire carried her own bag this time, light, organized, deliberate. As they waited at the gate, she scrolled through the agenda one last time. Ethan was beside her, typing something on his laptop, the glow of the screen sharp against his face. "Would you like coffee before boarding?" she asked, her tone calm, professional. He didn't look up. "No, thank you." Claire nodded, glancing at the people around them, families chatting softly, business travelers murmuring into phones, a little girl pressing her face to the window, waving at the planes. The ordinary hum of life filled the air, and for the first time in a long time, Claire felt part of it, not an observer, not invisible present. When their flight was called, Ethan stood, gesturing for her to follow. As they walked down the jet bridge, she caught a glimpse of their reflections in the glass again. Two travelers, one world apart without realizing it. Once seated, Ethan opened his laptop immediately. Claire placed her bag beneath the seat, then looked out the window. The runway stretched endlessly, silver under the morning sun. A soft hum filled the cabin as the engine started. She rested her hand on her lap, feeling a quiet thrill rise in her chest. This wasn't just another business trip. It was a threshold small, invisible, but real. The plane began to move. Seattle's skyline grew smaller, dissolving into the clouds. Claire watched it fade until only white remained. For years, she had lived by Ethan's tempo, fast, sharp, efficient. But up here, suspended between clouds and light, the world slowed down. She could almost hear her own heartbeat. Ethan glanced sideways briefly, noticing the faint reflection of sunlight on her glasses. Then he looked back at his laptop, unaware that something new had entered the space between them, quiet, unspoken, waiting. The flight attendant passed by with coffee. Claire smiled politely, declined, and turned back to the window. Below them, the Pacific stretched like an endless sheet of blue, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel small. By the time the captain announced their descent into Los Angeles, Claire felt a calm she couldn't quite explain. Her world hadn't changed overnight, but she had. As the plane dipped through the clouds, sunlight poured through the cabin, catching in her hair like threads of gold. Ethan didn't see it, not yet, but soon he would. The plane steadied itself above the clouds, wrapped in a hush that only existed at 30,000 feet. Outside the window, the world was all light soft, white, endless. Inside, the steady hum of the engines filled the silence between them. Ethan Cole sat by the aisle, his laptop open, his focus anchored to the glowing screen. Rows of numbers, projections, contracts, everything that made sense. Everything he could control. Across from him, Claire shifted slightly in her seat, unfolding the thin airline blanket before deciding she didn't need it. The cabin air was warmer than she expected. She reached up, unbuttoned her coat, and slipped it off carefully. The fabric brushed against her arm, the faint scent of lavender rising with the motion. Ethan didn't notice at first. He was halfway through a financial report, eyes flicking from one line to the next. But when she leaned forward to place her coat into the overhead compartment, the movement caught in the corner of his vision, subtle, unplanned. He looked up, instinctively, and, for a second, forgot what he was doing. The light from the window fell across her like something deliberate. Her hair shorter now, softly curled at the ends, caught hints of gold where the sun touched it. Her blouse, simple and pale, traced the quiet confidence in the way she sat back down, her posture straight, her expression calm. She didn't notice him looking. She was scrolling through the trip itinerary on her tablet, completely absorbed. It wasn't beauty that startled him. It was presence. He blinked, looked back at his screen. The words blurred for half a second before falling back into focus. Get it together. Cole. He adjusted in his seat, his tone even as he spoke. You confirmed the 3P... meeting with the construction leads. She nodded, not looking up. Yes. And the project manager will meet us at the resort first thing tomorrow. Good, he replied, too quickly. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, just new. Ethan tried to concentrate again, fingers hovering above the keyboard, but something strange lingered at the edge of his mind. It wasn't attraction, not yet. It was recognition, the unsettling feeling of seeing something familiar and realizing you'd never really looked before. He cleared his throat and leaned back, closing the laptop with a soft click. You can rest if you want. It'll be a long day once we land. I'm fine, she said quietly. He nodded, pretending to relax. But every few minutes, his attention drifted again to the reflection of sunlight on her glasses. the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the small, steady rhythm of her breath. He told himself it didn't matter, didn't. He told himself she was his assistant, competent, professional, predictable, that was all, and yet, somewhere deep inside, a small fracture appeared in that certainty. The flight attendant came by, offering drinks. Claire smiled politely. "Just water, please." Ethan ordered coffee, though he barely touched it. The smell reminded him of the office, of control, of his world before this morning, a world that suddenly felt narrower than he remembered. Halfway through the flight, the cabin lights dimmed. People settled into the soft quiet of travel screens glowing faintly. The occasional cough, the rustle of blankets. Claire leaned her head slightly toward the window, watching the clouds drift below like soft waves. There was something peaceful about her stillness, something that contrasted sharply with the restless energy inside him. Ethan glanced at her again once, then once more. She looked serene, untouched by the pressure he lived with every day. It unsettled him, how unaffected she seemed by his presence. Everyone else in his orbit bent slightly to his gravity. But Claire, she just existed beside him, steady, unbothered. He turned his attention to the clouds outside, their edges glowing faintly in the afternoon sun. The world below was invisible, just light and distance. A strange thought came to him. Then maybe this was what freedom looked like, not control, not success, just the quiet of being suspended above everything. He glanced at her again. She had fallen asleep, her chin resting lightly against her hand. The faintest smile touched her lips, the kind that appears without reason. For a brief moment, Ethan allowed himself to simply look. There was no calculation in it, no purpose, just curiosity. A man, for once, noticing the person who'd been right in front of him for 2 years. He caught himself and looked away. Too long, too close. He reached for his laptop again, opened it, stared at the blank screen for a full minute before giving up. His mind wasn't on work anymore, though he refused to admit it. He adjusted his tie, the small, controlled motion grounding him. This was nothing. A passing thought, a flicker of distraction. But when the plane began its slow descent, the light outside turned golden, spilling through the cabin like a whisper of warmth. Claire stirred beside him, waking, her eyes still soft with sleep. She turned slightly toward the window, and for the first time, their gazes met not at work, not across a desk, but here, between sky and earth. "Almost there," he said, his voice quieter than usual. She nodded, smiling faintly. "It looks beautiful from up here." He followed her gaze, looking out the window. The ocean below caught the sunlight, vast and shimmering, like molten glass. "Yes," he said finally, "it does." The plane shuddered gently as it dipped lower, the coastline of California beginning to appear in the distance. He leaned back, eyes on the horizon. The feeling in his chest strange, unfamiliar, refused to leave. He told himself it would fade when they landed, that it was just the altitude, the fatigue, the stillness of being between worlds. But somewhere deep down, Ethan Cole knew better. Something had shifted in the quiet of that flight, something small, but irreversible. And though he didn't have a name for it yet, it felt suspiciously like the beginning of a story he hadn't meant to start. The California sun was a different kind of light. It didn't slip shyly through clouds the way it did in Seattle. It poured golden and generous, filling every corner, every breath, every thought. When Claire stepped out of the terminal, the warmth hit her skin like a quiet welcome. She squinted at the wide sky, impossibly blue, stretching far beyond anything she remembered. For a moment, she just stood there, letting the air settle around her. It smelled like salt and sunscreen and something new. Beside her, Ethan was already on a call, his tone crisp and efficient. His black suit seemed almost out of place in this sunlit world, like a shadow walking through color. The driver, a man in his 40s with sunglasses and a tan that spoke of years in the coastal light, lifted their luggage into the back of the car. "Welcome to California," he said with an easy smile. "Thank you," Claire replied, her voice soft but alive with quiet energy. As the car began its journey along the coast, the city slowly gave way to open road. The Pacific appeared beside them, endless and alive, waves curling against the sand in slow rhythm. Claire pressed her palm lightly to the window, as if the glass could somehow let her feel the ocean breeze. Ethan glanced up from his phone once. Briefly, she was watching the horizon, her face calm, lips parted slightly in wonder. He followed her gaze out the window, though he'd seen that view countless times on business trips. Somehow, it looked different through her eyes. The driver pointed ahead. "That's Malibu Horizon Resort, your destination. Best view in the area, hands down." Claire smiled. "It's beautiful. Wait till sunset," the man said, grinning in the rearview mirror. "You'll see what I mean." The car turned into a long, winding driveway lined with palm trees. The ocean stretched out behind the property, its edge meeting the sky in a seamless blur of light. The main building was modern and glass-walled, its structure blending into the landscape as if it had grown there rather than been built. When the car stopped, Claire stepped out first. The sea breeze caught her hair, tousling it just slightly. She closed her eyes, breathing it in. Sun, wind, space. After years of fluorescent lights and the hum of elevators, the openness of it all felt almost unreal. Ethan stepped beside her, still focused on his phone. "We'll meet with the project manager at 5, he said, glancing toward the lobby. She nodded. Understood. But her gaze lingered on the view, the waves rolling, the sun sparkling against the water like scattered glass. A gull cried somewhere overhead. She smiled, not for anyone, just to herself. Inside, the resort lobby was all clean lines and calm tones. Glass walls opened to an infinity pool that seemed to spill directly into the ocean. Claire followed Ethan to the reception desk, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. When the receptionist greeted them with "Welcome to Malibu Horizon," Claire's heart fluttered unexpectedly. Welcome. It had been so long since she'd felt like anywhere was saying that to her. Their rooms were adjacent, facing the ocean. Claire thanked the bellman, stepped inside, and froze. The view from her window was breathtaking, the horizon stretching endlessly, sunlight dancing on water. The curtains swayed gently in the sea breeze that slipped through the cracked balcony door. She set down her bag and laughed quietly to herself, a small sound, like a sigh of disbelief. Then, slowly, she walked to the balcony and stepped out. The sunlight wrapped around her shoulders. The air smelled of salt and wild grass. Below, she could see a group of workers by the construction site of the new research center, the steel beams catching the light like ribbons of silver. She leaned on the railing, her fingers tracing the warm metal. For the first time in a long time, she felt open. The endlessness of the sea seemed to whisper something she hadn't allowed herself to hear. For years, you can start again. For a moment, she forgot entirely about Ethan, about schedules, about meetings. There was only the ocean and the quiet rhythm of her own breath. A knock on the door broke the spell. Claire Ethan's voice. She turned. "Yes, we'll meet downstairs in 30. I'll be ready." When the door closed, she lingered another minute before going inside. Her reflection in the window caught her off guard, hair gently tousled, skin warm from the sun. There was a softness there, a quiet confidence she hadn't seen before. She smiled faintly. "So, this is what it feels like," she whispered. Downstairs. The lobby glowed in the afternoon light. Ethan stood by the glass doors, phone in hand again. When she approached, he gave a brief nod without looking up. But when they stepped outside together, the light shifted, and for the first time, he noticed her hair, kissed golden by the sun, the calm in her eyes, the grace in her movement. He couldn't quite place what was different, but something in him paused, just for a heartbeat. They walked toward the construction site in silence, the sound of waves following them. Claire kept her pace even, her steps firm. She felt the breeze brush her skin, the warmth seeping through her blouse, and something deep within her began to loosen. As they reached the edge of the site, Ethan stopped to speak with the project team. Claire listened quietly, taking notes, her tone professional as always. But her gaze drifted off into the horizon, to the endless blue. When the meeting ended, the team dispersed, leaving them standing alone by the edge of the resort's property. The ocean stretched before them, vast and alive. Claire turned slightly, the sunlight touching her face. "It's different here," she said softly. Ethan looked at her. Different. Yes. Her eyes stayed on the water, the light, the air. It feels like freedom. He didn't answer right away. The wind lifted her hair again, carrying her words with it. Freedom. He wondered when was the last time he'd thought about that word. As they walked back toward the resort, the sound of the waves followed them, steady and endless. Claire glanced once more at the horizon before stepping inside. Something inside her had shifted, too. Small, quiet, but real. The woman who had left Seattle in gray silence was beginning to bloom under the California sun. And though Ethan hadn't realized it yet, he was standing in the presence of that change like a man watching a sunrise without knowing that daylight had already begun. The afternoon light in Malibu had a way of softening everything it touched. The ocean shimmered beyond the glass walls of the resort, and even the voices in the lobby seemed quieter, as if the air itself had learned to move gently here. Claire followed Ethan through the spacious entrance, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. Her notebook was in hand, her expression composed, though her eyes still held traces of wonder from the drive along the coast. A man approached them from across the lobby, his stride confident, his smile warm and easy. He was tall, maybe mid-30s, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at the edges. "Mr. Cole," he greeted, extending a hand. His voice carried a rich accent, Spanish, melodic, and smooth. "Welcome to Malibu Horizon. I'm Marco Rivera, the general manager." Ethan shook his hand firmly. "Thank you. Everything ready for our stay?" "Of course," Marco said, his tone friendly. Then his gaze shifted to Claire, and for a moment, his professionalism softened into something else. "And you must be Ms. Bennett." Claire blinked, caught slightly off guard. "Yes, that's right," she replied with a polite smile. Marco's eyes warmed with genuine admiration. "Welcome to the Horizon. It's not every day we have a guest who brings this much grace into our lobby." Claire let out a small, almost nervous laugh. "That's very kind of you. Mr. Rivera. Please, call me Marco," he said, still smiling. Ethan cleared his throat, sharp enough to break the moment. "We'll need access to the meeting rooms this afternoon," he said curtly, pulling the conversation back to business. "Of course," Marco replied easily. "Our conference wing faces the ocean. It's private and quiet, perfect for your sessions. I'll have my assistant prepare refreshments." His attention flicked back to Claire for just a second. "Would you like me to arrange a short tour for Mrs. Bennett while you get settled? The view from the terrace is something you shouldn't miss." Before she could respond, Ethan cut in. "That won't be necessary. We have a tight schedule." Marco nodded politely, though the hint of amusement never left his face. "Understood. Still, if you change your mind..." His gaze lingered just long enough to make Ethan shift slightly in place. As Marco walked away, Ethan turned toward Claire, his tone clipped. "He's certainly enthusiastic." Claire looked down at her notes, hiding a small smile. "He's just doing his job." Ethan's reply was non-committal. But as they moved toward the elevators, something tightened in his chest. It was a familiar feeling irritation, though he couldn't explain why. The elevator doors slid shut, and for a brief moment, their reflections stood side by side in the mirrored walls. Claire's face was calm, her posture relaxed. The sunlight through the glass caught the faint shimmer of her hair. Ethan's eyes flicked toward her, then away. Almost immediately, when they reached the conference level, staff members moved quickly to prepare the space. Claire went over the agenda with quiet focus, her voice steady and efficient. Ethan watched her from across the room as she worked, directing others, organizing materials with an ease that drew subtle respect from everyone present. But every now and then, his gaze drifted to the way she tucked her pen behind her ear, to the small curve of a smile when something went right, and then he caught himself. He didn't look away fast enough. Mr. Cole Claire's voice pulled him back. He blinked. Yes, the catering team needs approval for tomorrow's luncheon menu. Would you like to review it now or later? Later, he said quickly, a little too sharp. Of course. She turned back to her notes. Unbothered, he exhaled, steadying himself. Focus. Cole. She's your assistant, that's all. Outside, the sun dipped lower, stretching long shadows across the polished floor. By the time the meeting ended, the sky had begun to turn gold. Ethan dismissed the team and turned toward Claire. You can take an hour before dinner. We'll meet Marco and the investors at 7. She nodded. Understood. As she left the conference room, Marco appeared again at the end of the hall, as if by coincidence. Ms. Bennett, he called, smiling. How did your first day go? Claire paused. Busy, she admitted with a laugh. But beautiful. He grinned. That's Malibu for you. Come walk with me for a moment. The sunset here only lasts a few minutes. It would be a crime to miss it. She hesitated, glancing back toward the conference room. Ethan was still inside, gathering his things. Her instinct said she should decline, but something else in her said, yes. Just a few minutes. She agreed softly. They stepped out onto the terrace, where the sky was beginning to melt into pink and gold. The ocean stretched endlessly, waves catching the last light like sparks. Marco leaned on the railing beside her, his voice gentle. I grew up near here. My mother used to say the ocean teaches patience. It never rushes, but it always gets where it's going. Claire smiled, her eyes on the horizon. That sounds like good advice. It is, he said, and forgive me for saying this, but I think you're the kind of person who deserves a little less rushing and a little more sunlight. She looked at him then, surprised by the kindness in his tone. For a moment, she couldn't find words. Inside, through the glass wall, Ethan stood frozen in place. He had come to remind her of the time, but the sight before him stopped him cold. Claire, standing in the warm light, her hair catching the color of the sky, her expression soft as she listened to Marco speak. Something twisted deep in his chest, an ache sharp and unfamiliar. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was something he couldn't name. When Claire finally turned and saw him watching, she gave a small nod, as if asking silently if it was time. Ethan nodded back once, his face unreadable. Marco noticed the exchange and smiled. Ah, duty calls, he said. Until next time, Ms. Bennett. Thank you. Marco, she replied quietly, then followed Ethan inside. Neither spoke as they walked through the hallway, the air between them thick with something unspoken. At the elevator, Ethan pressed the button a little too firmly. The doors slid open, and they stepped in. The ride was silent. Only the sound of the elevator humming filled the space. When the doors opened to their floor, Claire turned to him. Is something wrong? He met her gaze briefly. No, he said, too quickly, not at all. But when she walked away toward her room, her silhouette framed by the soft light of the corridor, Ethan stayed where he was, watching until she disappeared behind the door. He stood there for a long moment, hands in his pockets, the distant sound of the ocean drifting through the open windows. He told himself it was nothing, just irritation, a simple distraction. But deep down, a thought he didn't want to name began to form, quiet and persistent as the tide. Why did it bother me so much to see her smile at someone else? The sun was beginning to sink when Ethan found himself standing by the poolside, his laptop bag slung over his shoulder, his tie loosened from the long day of meetings. The air smelled of salt and jasmine, and the sky had begun to melt into streaks of rose and amber. He hadn't meant to come here. He'd told himself he would return to his room, review tomorrow's agenda, maybe catch up on calls. But something had drawn him down, perhaps the pull of the ocean, or perhaps something quieter, something he hadn't yet dared to name. The pool shimmered in the golden light, smooth as glass except where the water rippled around the slow, graceful movements of a lone swimmer. For a moment, he didn't recognize her. All he saw was the fluid rhythm, the way she moved through the water, effortless and free, as though the weight of the world had finally lifted from her shoulders. Then she surfaced, and the light caught her face, and his breath caught with it. Claire, her hair, darker from the water, clung softly to her cheeks. Droplets shimmered against her skin, turning her into something almost ethereal in the fading light. She brushed her hair back and smiled faintly to herself, one of those rare, private smiles meant for no one. It struck him harder than he expected, that simple, unguarded joy. For 2 years, she had been the quiet constant in his orbit, efficient, reserved, invisible in her precision. And yet, standing here, he realized he had never really seen her, not like this, not as a person, but as a presence. A woman fully alive beneath the glow of a California sunset. He swallowed hard, unable to look away. She floated on her back now, her face tilted toward the sky, her body outlined by the golden reflection of the dying sun. The world around her, the pool, the palms, the soft hum of the ocean seemed to fade into a single frame of stillness. He felt something stir in his chest, sharp and unfamiliar, like a spark against old stone. He told himself to leave. This wasn't appropriate. It wasn't professional. He was her boss, for God's sake. But his feet didn't move. He stayed, trapped somewhere between reason and something he couldn't quite control. When Claire finally swam to the edge, she didn't notice him right away. She rested her elbows on the side, breathing softly, her skin glowing under the last traces of light. Then she turned, and their eyes met. For a second, neither of them spoke. The moment stretched, long and weightless. "Mr. Cole," she said finally, her voice calm, but with a hint of surprise. "I didn't realize you were here." He cleared his throat, his tone a little too stiff. "I was just passing by." Her lips curved slightly. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" He followed her gaze toward the horizon. The sun was dipping into the ocean now, a slow burn of gold giving way to deep crimson. The reflection trembled on the water's surface, and for a moment, he wondered if the sky was blushing too. "Yes," he said quietly. "It is." She smiled again, and something inside him shifted. There was a peace about her, a kind of quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. It unnerved him how calm she looked, how sure of herself. He realized that somewhere between Seattle and Malibu, the woman who used to blend into the background had stepped fully into the light. Claire reached for a towel, wrapping it gently around her shoulders. "I didn't think I'd have time to swim," she said, "but Marco said the sunsets here are worth it." He wasn't wrong. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly at the mention of the manager's name. "He seems friendly?" She looked at him curiously. "He's been kind, that's all." "Kind," Ethan repeated, the word tasting strange on his tongue. She tilted her head, studying him for a moment, as if sensing the tension beneath his even tone. Then she looked back toward the ocean. "You should try it sometime," she said softly. "Just let the world slow down for a while." He almost smiled, but it faltered halfway. "I don't think that's in my nature." "Maybe not," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "But you might be surprised what happens when you stop trying to control everything." Her words lingered longer than he wanted them to. She didn't say them as a challenge, just an observation, but somehow, they found a place to land inside him, unsettling and true. She turned to leave, walking past him toward the exit. Her steps were unhurried, her presence leaving behind a faint scent of salt and jasmine. He watched her go, the towel draped loosely over her shoulders, the golden light tracing the curve of her neck, her silhouette fading into the soft shadows of dusk. When she disappeared around the corner, the quiet returned. Only the whisper of the waves and the soft rustle of palm leaves remained. Ethan exhaled, realizing he'd been holding his breath. He sat down at one of the lounge chairs, elbows on his knees, staring at the place where she'd stood. He couldn't explain the feeling. It wasn't just attraction. It was something deeper, more dangerous. It was the sudden awareness of everything he'd overlooked, everything he'd dismissed. 2 years, 2 years of coffee cups, meeting notes, travel schedules, 2 years of nods and brief glances. How had he missed her in all that time? The sun finally sank below the horizon, leaving behind only a thin line of light. Ethan leaned back, his gaze unfocused, his thoughts tangled. Somewhere in the distance, laughter echoed from the terrace, a sound that used to feel like background noise. But now, it felt alive. He didn't move for a long while. The pool shimmered softly under the new twilight, the water now a mirror of silver and shadow. He imagined her laughter carried on the wind, faint but clear. Something inside him whispered that this was dangerous, that he was crossing into something he couldn't control. But another part of him, the part that had been numb for years, didn't care. When he finally rose to leave, the sky had turned indigo. He walked slowly back toward the resort, his mind replaying the image of her in the water, her calm, her grace, her light. For the first time, Ethan Cole, the man who built his world on logic and order, felt a quiet kind of chaos settle inside him. And though he didn't yet know it, that single moment by the pool would become the point of no return, the instant where everything he thought he understood about himself began to change. The following evening, the resort came alive under soft golden lights. The patio overlooking the ocean had been transformed into a private networking reception, crystal glasses, muted jazz, and the gentle scent of salt in the air. The guests moved like well-dressed shadows among candlelit tables, their laughter blending with the rhythm of the waves below. Ethan stood near the bar, a glass of bourbon in his hand, scanning the crowd with the practiced gaze of a man who always observed more than he showed. He was used to events like this surface-level charm, veiled negotiations, the dance of power and profit. Normally, he would have felt at home here, calm and in control. But tonight, something was off. Because somewhere across the patio, Claire was laughing. He hadn't planned to look for her. He told himself it was professional habit, that she was part of his team, and he simply needed to make sure everything was running smoothly. But when he saw her, standing in a soft cream dress that caught the light every time she moved, all the air seemed to shift around him. Claire was speaking with a small group of investors, her expression open, her gestures graceful. And then there was him, Andrew Miles, young, charismatic, a rising name in venture capital, the kind of man who thrived in this world of handshakes and smiles. Andrew stood close to her, too close, leaning in with that confident ease that came from knowing he could charm anyone in the room. Claire didn't seem to mind. She was listening, genuinely interested, her laughter light but not forced. She wasn't flirting. Ethan knew that much. She was simply being herself, warm, intelligent, present, and that was what unsettled him the most. Andrew said something that made her laugh again, her head tilting back slightly, her eyes shining. The sound was soft, but it carried, threading through the hum of voices until it reached him. Ethan's jaw tightened, his fingers curled around his glass until the cool surface pressed sharply into his palm. He told himself it was nothing, just conversation, just Claire being polite. But deep down, he felt it, a flicker of something hot and unreasonable curling beneath his ribs. Jealousy. It was absurd. He had no claim on her. She worked for him. She was his assistant. That was all. And yet, when Andrew reached out and lightly touched her arm, Ethan's entire body went still. He didn't hear the rest of what the man beside him was saying. He didn't even realize the drink in his hand was untouched. All he could see was the way Claire smiled back, small, polite, but enough to send another surge of irritation through him. He set his glass down on the bar a little too hard. The clink drew a glance from the bartender, but Ethan didn't notice. He made his way toward them, slow, deliberate, the mask of composure firmly back in place. Mr. Miles. He greeted smoothly when he reached the group. His tone carried that faint edge of authority that always made people straighten instinctively. Andrew turned, smiling easily. Ethan Cole. Good to see you again. Likewise. He shifted his gaze briefly toward Claire. She met his eyes. And for a second, just a second, something flickered there. Surprise, maybe confusion, then professionalism. She nodded slightly, as if acknowledging his silent question. Are you all right? Claire was just telling us about the new research center. Andrew said, You've got quite the project here. Impressive vision. Ethan smiled faintly. We like to think so. There was a subtle pause. Andrew, oblivious to the undercurrent, raised his glass toward Claire. You should join us later, Ms. Bennett. A few of us are heading to the bar down by the beach. Best margaritas in Malibu, I promise. Claire hesitated, glancing briefly at Ethan before replying. That's kind of you, but I have some reports to finish tonight. Andrew laughed. Work can wait when you're in California. Not for me, she said, still smiling but firm. Some habits are hard to break. Ethan felt a strange, quiet satisfaction at that answer, though he kept his expression neutral. Andrew shrugged good-naturedly. You're lost then. But if you change your mind... Claire nodded politely, ending the exchange with grace. As the group drifted toward another conversation, Ethan lingered beside her. For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them hummed with the faint sound of music and the whisper of the sea. Finally, she said softly, you didn't have to come over. He looked at her. Didn't I? She smiled slightly, sensing the weight beneath his calm. Everything's fine. Ethan. He nodded once, eyes flicking toward the crowd, where Andrew stood laughing with another group. It's just part of the job, he said quietly. Knowing who's talking to whom? Of course, she replied. You've always been very good at that. But her tone held something else, a quiet awareness he couldn't quite read. A breeze moved through the patio, carrying the scent of salt and jasmine again, the same scent that had clung to her the night before. It stirred something in him, something restless, almost dangerous. He turned toward the ocean, the lights from the resort reflecting across the water. You should take a break after this trip, he said, his voice lower now. You've been working non-stop. She looked at him, surprised by the gentleness in his tone. I will, she said after a moment. Maybe I already have. In some way. He met her gaze, then really met it. For once, she didn't look away. Her eyes were steady, calm, but filled with something he couldn't name. The silence stretched between them, fragile and full. Then someone called his name from across the patio, and the moment broke. Ethan turned, nodding mechanically, before facing her again. We should head inside soon. Yes, she said softly. We should. They walked back toward the lobby together, the night wrapping around them like a tide. Behind them, laughter drifted through the air, mingled with the sound of glasses and waves. Ethan's hand brushed hers once, unintentionally. She didn't move away, but she didn't react either. Just a fleeting touch, a spark that neither acknowledged but both felt. When they reached the elevator, he pressed the button and kept his eyes on the floor numbers above the door. That small flicker of jealousy still burned quietly in his chest, unwanted, uninvited, but very much alive. And as the doors closed, sealing them in the soft hum of silence, Ethan realized the truth he'd been trying to deny. He wasn't just noticing her anymore. He was losing his balance because of her. And for a man like Ethan Cole, that was far more dangerous than any business risk he'd ever taken. The night air was heavy with the scent of salt and distant rain. Waves murmured beyond the glass walls, their rhythms steady and slow, like a heartbeat in the dark. Inside the resort's meeting room, only one lamp remained lit, its light spilling softly across the polished table and the neat stacks of paper laid between them. Claire sat opposite Ethan, her posture calm, her eyes lowered toward the agenda she'd prepared. The soft blue of her dress caught the golden glow from the lamp, turning the air around her into something tender. A few strands of her hair, still damp from her shower, clung lightly to her neck. Ethan told himself to focus. On the figures, on the reports, on anything but her. He leaned back slightly, pretending to review the project brief. "The investor review will take place at 9 tomorrow," he said evenly. "Make sure the presentation file is finalized tonight." Claire nodded, her voice low. "It's ready. I've checked everything twice." He hesitated before replying, his gaze flicking up. Twice she smiled faintly. Old habits. That small curve of her lips did something to him, something unexpected, almost disorienting. He had seen her smile before, of course, but not like this. Not soft, not unguarded, not real. He looked back at the papers in front of him, though the words no longer made sense. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the faint sound of the ocean and the ticking of his watch. Claire shifted slightly, her fingers brushing the edge of her pen. "Mr. Cole," she said quietly. "Is there something wrong with my work?" He looked up, startled. "No, of course not. Why would you think that?" She shrugged lightly, her tone calm. "You've been different since yesterday." The words hung there, suspended between them. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. What could he possibly say that he'd barely slept, haunted by the image of her in the water, her laughter, the light in her eyes that he'd spent the entire day trying and failing to ignore the pull of something he didn't want to name. He cleared his throat. "You're imagining it." She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Maybe," she said softly. The silence returned, heavier this time. He tried again to focus on the agenda. "We'll go over the layout changes tomorrow morning. The contractors should Ethan." Her voice stopped him. "Not Mr. Cole, just Ethan." It landed softly but firmly, pulling the ground out from under him. He looked at her. The way she said his name, careful, deliberate, felt like a key turning in a lock. Yes, he managed. She didn't look away. "Why are you angry?" He blinked, surprised. "I'm not angry." She tilted her head slightly. "Then what are you?" He exhaled slowly, setting his pen down. "I don't know," he admitted, the words quieter than he meant them to be. Claire nodded, her eyes still on him. "That's honest," she said. Something in her tone, calm, steady, unnerved him more than if she had shouted. It was the kind of composure that came from understanding something he didn't. The sound of the waves deepened, the rhythm of the night pressing closer. Ethan stood abruptly, walking toward the window. His reflection stared back at him, dark and fractured by the glass. Behind it, the ocean shimmered faintly under the moonlight. He spoke without turning around. "I don't like seeing you with people like Andrew Miles." The words escaped before he could stop them. There was a pause. Then her voice came, quiet but firm. "People like him?" He turned slightly, flirtatious, superficial. She raised an eyebrow. "And you think I can't handle that?" "That's not what I said." "No," she replied, her tone even. "But it's what you meant." He stared at her, caught between defensiveness and something dangerously close to vulnerability. "I just don't want." He stopped himself. What she pressed gently? "You don't want what?" "Ethan?" He turned away again, jaw tight. Forget it. The silence that followed was sharp, almost fragile. Claire watched him for a long moment before speaking, her voice softer now. "You've never had to question how you see people, have you?" He frowned. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then said, "You see what fits your world, what makes sense to you. Everyone else becomes background." Her words landed like a quiet blow. He didn't answer. Claire stood then, gathering her notes, her movements precise and controlled. "I used to be fine with that," she continued. "Being invisible, it was easier." She stopped at the end of the table, looking at him across the space between them. "But I'm not invisible anymore." The lamplight caught her hair again, the faint shimmer of gold at its edges. Ethan's throat tightened. "I know," he said quietly. Their eyes met his, full of confusion, hers full of something gentler, but sadder too. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then she broke the gaze, slipping her notes into a folder. "Good night, Ethan." He wanted to stop her, to say something that would make sense of what was happening, but the words wouldn't come. He just stood there. His reflection doubled in the glass, one version of himself looking out at the sea, the other staring helplessly at the woman walking away. When the door closed softly behind her, the sound seemed to echo through the room. He stayed there long after she'd gone, the air still carrying the faint trace of her perfume, the whisper of the waves below. For years, Ethan Cole had built a life where feelings were neatly boxed, labeled, and stored away. But tonight, under the weight of the ocean's hush and the fading warmth of her voice, those boxes began to crack. He looked back at the empty chairs she'd left behind, the faint impression of her presence still lingering. And in that stillness, he realized something he couldn't quite admit, not to her, not even to himself. It wasn't anger that had burned through him all evening. It was longing, quiet, dangerous, and impossible to control. Morning came with a soft gold that slipped through the glass walls of the conference hall. The ocean outside was calm, its surface gleaming like brushed silver beneath the early light. Inside, the air buzzed quietly with the low murmur of conversation, the shuffle of papers, the faint clink of coffee cups. The investors had gathered, men and women in tailored suits, their expressions sharp, their voices measured. Ethan stood near the front, adjusting the mic clip to his jacket, his usual armor of composure firmly in place. He glanced around the room, scanning every detail with habitual precision, but his gaze paused when the door opened. Claire walked in. She wore a soft gray suit, elegant, simple, perfectly cut. Her hair fell neatly around her face, and the light caught on the faint sheen of her earrings. She carried a folder in one hand, a cup of coffee in the other, moving with quiet confidence. There was nothing showy about her, nothing loud. Yet somehow, the energy in the room shifted when she entered. Ethan felt it too, the same feeling that had unsettled him for days now, pride, admiration, and something far more dangerous tangled beneath. He told himself to focus. This was a crucial presentation, a moment months in the making. But when Claire took her seat beside the projector, readying her notes, he realized that his pulse had picked up not from nerves, but from the calm certainty she radiated. When the meeting began, it was smooth at first. Ethan spoke clearly, his slides crisp, his words deliberate. But soon, the technical section arrived, the part Claire had prepared. He glanced at her, nodding slightly, and stepped back. She rose without hesitation. Her voice, when it came, was soft but steady, clear as water. She spoke about innovation and human impact, about design and sustainability, about the soul of the project, not just the structure. Her words carried something that numbers couldn't: sincerity, vision, the kind of quiet passion that made people lean in instead of check their phones. The investors began to listen differently. Heads tilted, pens paused. Even the ever-distracted Andrew Miles sat forward, eyes on her. Ethan stood at the edge of the room, watching. He had heard her speak countless times before meeting summaries, schedule briefings, crisp, efficient updates. But this was different. She wasn't reciting data. She was owning it. Her hands moved subtly as she spoke, not rehearsed, just natural. Her confidence was gentle, never forced. And when she smiled a real, open smile, it seemed to light the room in a way even the morning sun couldn't. When she finished, there was a beat of silence. Then, applause. Not the polite kind, but the genuine sort that filled the air like a wave. One of the senior investors, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and an elegant demeanor, spoke first. "Ms. Bennett," she said, her tone both warm and curious. "How long have you been with Cole Dynamics?" "Almost 3 years," Claire replied, meeting her gaze steadily. The woman smiled. "You have an impressive grasp of the project. Have you ever considered leading one of your own? My company could use someone with your clarity and conviction. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Ethan felt it too, a tightness in his chest he hadn't expected. He waited for Claire to blush, to retreat behind modesty the way she might have months ago. But she didn't. Instead, she smiled, gracious, poised. "That's very kind of you," she said. "For now, I'm happy where I am, but thank you for seeing me." Her tone was calm, self-assured, almost radiant. She wasn't hiding anymore. The woman nodded approvingly. "Well," she said, "if you ever change your mind—" The conversation moved on, but Ethan didn't. He stood there, watching her, his mind a blur. Pride surged through him, unexpected and sharp, but beneath it was something else, a quiet fear, not of losing her professionally, though that was part of it. It was something more personal, the realization that she no longer needed his approval. She had outgrown the quiet shadow he had once kept her in. After the meeting ended, people clustered around her shaking her hand, complimenting her insight, thanking her for her clarity. She laughed easily, graciously, accepting praise with a kind of grace that seemed entirely her own. Ethan stayed back, observing from the edge of the crowd. He wanted to say something, to congratulate her, but every word he rehearsed felt inadequate. Marco appeared at her side, smiling. "You were extraordinary," he said warmly. "Thank you," Claire replied, her tone light. "I meant it," he continued. "You spoke with the kind of confidence that makes people believe. That's rare." She smiled again, softer this time. "That's kind of you." Ethan's jaw tightened, just slightly. He hated that even now. Even after everything, that flicker of jealousy still burned somewhere deep inside him. But this time, it wasn't about Marco. It wasn't about anyone else. It was about her. About how she had stepped into her own light and how, somehow, that light made the rest of his world look dimmer. When the crowd finally dispersed, Claire turned toward him. Their eyes met across the room. "You were incredible," he said quietly when she reached him. Her smile held no trace of shyness, only calm gratitude. "Thank you," she said. "It felt good to finally speak for myself." "You've always been capable of that," he said, his voice lower. "You just didn't always let yourself—" She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Or maybe," she said gently, "I didn't think anyone was listening." The words struck deeper than she could have known. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of the ocean drifted faintly through the open doors, mingling with the distant hum of conversation. Then she picked up her folder, her expression soft but sure. "We should get ready for the next session." He nodded, though his voice didn't come. As she walked ahead, sunlight brushed against her hair, catching the faint gold in its strands. He watched her go, feeling something expand and tighten in equal measure. Claire Bennett, once invisible, quiet, contained, was no longer any of those things. She had stepped into her own power, and Ethan Cole, the man who had prided himself on control, suddenly found himself standing in awe and maybe just a little bit in fear of the woman he had never truly seen until now. Outside, the sea kept rolling against the shore, steady and unbothered, as if it already knew what he hadn't yet admitted, that nothing between them would ever be the same again. The afternoon light spilled across the pool deck in sheets of gold, turning the water into a mirror of the sky. Waves from the nearby shore whispered faintly through the palms, carrying the scent of salt and sun-warmed air. It should have been a calm moment, a perfect California afternoon, but for Ethan, it felt like standing inside a storm. He'd come down intending only to check on a few things, confirm a schedule, send a quick email, but his steps slowed when he saw them. Claire sat near the edge of the pool, sunlight pooling over her shoulders, her laughter soft and unguarded. Beside her stood Andrew Miles, relaxed, shirt sleeves rolled, confidence effortless. And a few feet away, Marco Rivera leaned casually against a lounge chair, his smile easy, his tone light. They looked like they belonged in that sunlit world, three people perfectly at ease, perfectly human. Ethan watching from a shaded corner of the patio, felt something twist in his chest. It started small, a heat that rose from the base of his throat. He told himself he was only observing, that it was his job to make sure everyone from his team stayed professional, that no boundaries blurred, no distractions crept in. But that wasn't the truth, and some part of him knew it. Claire turned slightly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. The movement was simple, but the light caught her at just the right angle, catching the soft curve of her smile. Andrew said something too quiet for Ethan to hear, and she laughed again, her voice carrying faintly through the breeze. Then Andrew's hand brushed her arm. It was nothing, really, a fleeting, casual touch. But to Ethan, it felt like a spark igniting gasoline. He sat forward instinctively, every muscle coiled. The rational part of his mind, the disciplined, measured part, told him to breathe, to stay where he was. But the pulse in his temple drummed louder than reason. He stood up. The chair scraped softly against the tile, but neither of them looked his way. He clenched his jaw, shoving his phone into his pocket, and started walking toward them. Each step felt too deliberate, too aware. The sun hit his shoulders like heat from an open flame. His heartbeat sounded louder with every footfall. By the time he reached them, he had already constructed the excuse in his head, something about work, or deadlines, or logistics, anything but the truth. "Claire," he said evenly, stopping a few feet away. "Can I have a word?" She blinked up at him, surprised but composed. "Of course." Andrew smiled, easy and unbothered. "We were just talking about the investor dinner tonight," he said. "You should join us. Ethan, maybe you can tell me how you convinced the board to approve that new AI prototype." "That's a feat." Ethan forced a polite smile. "Some things are better discussed in the boardroom. Mr. Miles?" Marco chuckled under his breath. "Or maybe by the poolside." Where everyone's less guarded, Ethan didn't answer. His gaze stayed on Claire. "I'll only take a minute." She hesitated, then nodded, rising from her seat. "Excuse me," she said quietly. As she stepped away, Andrew gave her a parting grin. "We'll be here if you change your mind about the dinner." Ethan didn't respond. He just led her a few yards away, near the edge of the terrace overlooking the ocean. The air was cooler there, but the tightness in his chest didn't ease. She turned to face him. "What's wrong, nothing," he said too quickly. Then, softer, "I just needed to clarify something about tomorrow's schedule." Her brows lifted slightly. "The schedule you finalized this morning." He hesitated. "I wanted to make sure you double-checked the contractors, Ethan," she interrupted, her tone calm but steady. "You don't have to make up a reason. Just say what you really came to say." The silence between them stretched. He stared out at the horizon, the line where sea met sky, endless and blinding. "I don't like seeing you with them," he said finally, his voice low. She frowned. "With who you know who?" She folded her arms gently, not defensive, just tired. "Andrew and Marco?" "Yes." Her tone softened, but her gaze didn't waver. "They're colleagues." "Investors. I was being polite. I know that," he said, but the words came out clipped, unconvincing. What he turned to her, the frustration and confusion spilling into his expression. "I don't like the way they look at you." For a moment, she didn't speak. The sound of the waves filled the space where words should have been. Then she said, quietly, "You mean the way you didn't?" The question hit harder than it should have. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Claire took a slow breath, her eyes searching his face. "You ignored me for years. Ethan? And now that someone else sees me, you suddenly what? Decide it matters." Her voice wasn't sharp, but it cut through him all the same. "It's not that simple," he said. "Then explain it." He couldn't. Not in a way that would make sense. Not when every explanation sounded like an admission he wasn't ready to give. So he looked away, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the horizon again. "You're right," he said finally. "Forget it." She watched him for a long moment. The tension around her eyes softened, but her voice stayed steady. You don't get to decide how people see me anymore, she said quietly. Not after you refuse to. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, the words sinking deeper than he wanted them to. When he opened them again, she was already walking back toward the pool. The light had shifted the sun lower now, brushing everything with a pale amber glow. Claire rejoined Andrew and Marco, smiling again, though something in her expression had changed. Calmer, freer. Ethan stayed where he was, watching her from the terrace. His reflection shimmered faintly in the glass door beside him, distorted by the glare of the sun. For years, control had been his strength, his certainty, his shield. But in that moment, he realized control was the very thing slipping through his fingers. He turned away, trying to steady his breathing, but the sound of her laughter reached him again, softer this time, but still enough to undo him. He gripped the railing, the metal hot beneath his palm. His throat tightened. He told himself again that it was just about work, about professionalism, about protecting the company's image. But deep down, he knew the truth. He wasn't protecting anything. He was breaking, and the worst part wasn't that she didn't belong to him. It was that she never had. The ocean roared softly below, the waves colliding in rhythm with the beat of his heart, steady, relentless, and aching. The night had fallen soft and warm over Malibu, wrapping the resort in a hush that smelled faintly of salt and jasmine. The pool shimmered under strings of golden lights, their reflections trembling gently with every ripple of water. Laughter drifted from the patio bar where the investors gathered, their voices fading into the rhythm of the waves below. Claire stood near the edge of the terrace, her hands resting lightly on the railing, the sea wind tugging at a loose strand of hair. She'd come out for a breath, a break from the polite noise of the evening. But she wasn't alone for long. Andrew Miles joined her, a glass of wine in his hand, his tone easy, unhurried. "You were remarkable today," he said, smiling. "I don't think anyone in that room could take their eyes off you." She laughed softly, looking out toward the dark horizon. "That's kind of you, but it was just work." "Maybe," he said, stepping a little closer, "but there's something about the way you carry yourself. Like you finally decided to stop hiding." Her smile faded slightly, not from discomfort, but from the weight of truth in his words. "Maybe I did," she murmured. The silence stretched. The ocean breathed in and out, steady and deep. Then Andrew leaned in, his voice lower now. "You deserve someone who sees that." His words brushed against the night like a secret, intimate and dangerous. Claire's breath caught for half a second, and she turned toward him just as he reached up his hand, light on her arm, his intent clear. But before he could close the space between them, another voice cut through the quiet. "Claire." It was Ethan. He stood only a few steps away, his expression unreadable, his posture rigid against the glow of the pool lights. The tension in his jaw was unmistakable. Andrew dropped his hand, his tone casual but edged. "Ethan, didn't see you there. That much is obvious," Ethan said. His voice was calm, but every word carried the precision of something barely restrained. Claire blinked, stepping slightly back. "What are you doing out here?" He looked at her, his gaze steady but burning. "I could ask you the same thing." Andrew chuckled quietly. "I think I'll give you two a moment." He set down his glass and walked off toward the bar, leaving the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance. The air grew still. Claire crossed her arms, the cool night brushing against her bare shoulders. "That was unnecessary." Ethan's eyes darkened. "He was about to kiss you." "So." Her voice was calm, but there was fire beneath it. "He didn't? That's not the point." "Then what is—" He took a step closer. "You shouldn't let people like him." "People like him," she cut in sharply. "You mean people who notice I exist?" He froze, the accusation hanging in the air like thunder before a storm. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the hush of the waves below, relentless, patient. Claire's voice dropped lower. "For 2 years, Ethan, 2 years I worked beside you. Early mornings, late nights. I knew your schedule, your moods, your silence. I tried so hard to be enough to be seen, and you barely looked at me." Her words trembled, not from weakness, but from release. "And now," she continued, her eyes bright in the lamplight, "the moment someone else sees me, suddenly you care. Suddenly you decide it's a problem." Ethan took another step forward, his voice tight. "It's not like that." "Then what is it like?" she demanded. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling hard. "I don't know. I just—" He stopped, struggling for the words. "When I saw him touch you, I wanted to break something." Her breath caught, but she didn't speak. "I know it's irrational," he went on, his voice quieter now. "I know I have no right, but I can't stand the thought of you with him, or with anyone else." Claire stared at him, the hurt in her eyes shifting slowly into disbelief. "Do you even hear yourself?" "Yes," he said softly. "For once." "I do." She shook her head. "You're jealous." "Ethan, that's not love. That's control." He looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "No, it's fear." Her brow furrowed. He stepped closer, his voice trembling just enough to make her heart falter. "Fear that I wasted 2 years pretending not to feel something that was there every single day? Fear that I broke something I didn't even realize I wanted until I saw someone else holding it." She didn't move, didn't breathe. He took one more step. "I was an idiot. Claire! I thought keeping distance meant control. I thought it made me stronger. But all it did was make me blind. I see you now. I can't stop seeing you." The night seemed to close in around them, the glow from the pool flickering across his face. Claire's voice was barely a whisper. "You think saying that makes it better?" "No," he said. "It just makes it true." She turned away, her hand tightening on the railing. "You don't get to say that now. Not after all this time." "I know," he said, "but I had to, even if it's too late." For a long, aching moment, the world seemed suspended the waves below, the rustle of palm leaves, the faint hum of music from the distance. Claire finally turned back toward him. Her expression was softer now, but her eyes glistened with something fragile. "You laughed at me once, Ethan," she said quietly. "Remember, you told me not to take things personally when you called me forgettable." He closed his eyes briefly, as if the memory itself burned. "I remember," he said hoarsely, "and I've hated myself for it ever since." She took a slow breath. "Then maybe this isn't about me anymore." He looked up, confused. "It's about you learning what you've lost," she said, "and me finally understanding what I deserve." Her words lingered, soft but final. He didn't try to stop her when she stepped past him, her footsteps quiet against the stone. She paused only once, her voice barely above the wind. "I don't know if I can forgive you. Not yet." He nodded, unable to speak. Then she was gone, her figure disappearing into the warm darkness beyond the lights. Ethan stood there, the sound of the waves rising around him like a confession. His reflection shimmered faintly on the pool surface, blurred, broken, unrecognizable. Above him, the stars burned quietly, indifferent and eternal, and for the first time in years, Ethan Cole felt small, human. He whispered into the night, the words carried away by the wind. "I love you, Claire," but she was too far away to hear. The last light of day stretched across the horizon like a soft ember, painting the California sky in hues of gold and rose. The air was warm, carrying the faint scent of salt and citrus. Waves whispered against the shore, steady and patient, as if time itself had slowed to listen. Claire stood at the edge of the terrace, her hair swaying gently in the breeze. The sunset brushed her skin in a quiet glow, and for a moment she let herself breathe deeply, fully, freely. She had not realized how long she'd been holding her breath, until now. Behind her, footsteps approached slow, hesitant. She didn't need to turn to know it was him. Ethan stopped a few feet away, his usual presence commanding, certain, softened now. His suit jacket was gone, sleeves rolled to his elbows, hands resting awkwardly in his pockets. For once, there was no armor between them, only silence. "Claire," he said quietly. She didn't move at first, only watched the sun dipping lower, its reflection trembling across the water. "You found me," she murmured. "I never stopped looking," he replied. His voice was low, rough at the edges. "I just didn't know what I was looking for." That made her turn, slowly. Their eyes met his, weary but honest, hers, calm but unreadable. The space between them was thick with all the words they hadn't said, all the moments they'd missed. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "For every time I made you feel small, for every day I didn't see you standing right in front of me." Claire watched him, her gaze steady. "And what changed?" He exhaled, the breath catching slightly in his throat. "You did," he said. "You changed. And it made me realize, maybe I was the one who needed to—" Her lips curved slightly, but not in a smile. "You're 2 years too late." "Ethan." The words hung between them, soft but certain, like a curtain gently falling. He nodded, eyes lowering for a moment. "I know." His voice trembled with something raw regret, humility, something that didn't quite have a name. "But if it isn't too late, I'd like to start over. Not as your boss, not as the man who thought he had all the answers, just as someone who finally learned to listen." The wind moved around them again, rustling the palm leaves overhead. Claire's heart ached at the sincerity in his tone, the vulnerability she had never seen in him before. She wanted to believe him. And maybe, in some quiet corner of her heart, she already did. She looked at him for a long time, really looked. The man who once seemed untouchable now stood before her, stripped of pride, of control, of certainty, and in that, he looked more human than he ever had. "I don't know what happens next," she said softly. "Neither do I," he admitted. "Maybe that's the point." The smallest smile touched her lips, then tired, but real. She reached out her hand. For a heartbeat. He didn't move. Then, slowly, he took it. It wasn't the kind of touch that promised forever. It wasn't a grand gesture or a cinematic kiss under the stars. It was something simpler, deeper a beginning, fragile and honest. The sun slipped below the horizon, leaving a faint pink shimmer over the waves. They stood there in the half-light, not speaking, not needing to. The silence between them no longer felt heavy. It felt like breathing again. For the first time, Ethan didn't see her as the quiet assistant who kept his world in order. He saw the woman who had rebuilt herself piece by piece, who had chosen to shine even after being dismissed. And Claire, she no longer saw him as the man who once made her feel invisible. She saw the man who had finally learned how to see. The tide rolled in, the sound steady, comforting. She glanced toward the horizon and whispered, almost to herself, "It's beautiful here." Ethan followed her gaze. "It is." Then, after a pause, "I never noticed before." She smiled faintly. "You weren't looking." The last light faded into dusk, the first stars appearing like quiet witnesses above them. Claire's hand lingered in his a moment longer, then slipped free. She turned toward the path leading back to the resort. "Come on," she said, her tone light, almost teasing. "We have an early flight tomorrow." He fell into step beside her, not as her CEO, but simply as a man walking beside a woman he had once overlooked and would never again. Behind them, the ocean kept breathing, endless and calm. Ahead, the night opened wide, waiting, and somewhere in that space between what was lost and what might still be found, two souls once trapped by pride and silence took their first quiet step towards something new. Not redemption, not perfection, just understanding. And that, perhaps, was enough. The wind softened, the stars steadied, and under the fading gold of the California sky, Ethan Cole finally smiled, not with power, but with peace. Sometimes, life teaches us its quietest lessons through the people we overlook. Ethan and Claire's story, isn't just about love, it's about seeing, truly seeing the human being in front of us, beyond titles, appearances, or the roles we expect them to play. Many of us, in our rush to control, achieve, or survive, forget to notice the quiet souls who hold things together, the ones who give, who wait, who endure without recognition, and sometimes, by the time we learn to see them, it feels too late. But it's never too late to change the way we look at others, to replace judgment with curiosity, pride with humility, and distance with kindness. Claire found her light not because someone finally saw her, but because she remembered how to see herself. And Ethan's redemption came when he learned to look through the eyes of the heart, not the eyes of power. In the end, that's what life keeps whispering to us. See people while they're still standing beside you. Listen before silence becomes regret. And never underestimate the quiet strength of a heart that chooses to grow instead of harden. Thank you so much for spending your time with Shining Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you pause for a moment of reflection, please give it a like. Share it with someone who might need a little warmth today. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Every story here is made with love to remind us that kindness, empathy, and understanding still matter. Stay with us for more heartfelt stories about life, love, and the quiet strength of being human.